Good morning once again. Welcome to the session on metrics and evaluation. I'm Lee Saperstein, 64, Montana and Queens. I started as a mining engineer and I worked most of my life as an academic mining engineer at Penn State, University of Kentucky, and the University of Missouri-Rolla, from which I retired with emeritus status as dean and professor. During that time,
Can you move the microphone a little closer to you?
I certainly can. Let's see what happens. I was sitting in the audience. I was hearing a certain amount of echo, and so I was trying to find just the right place. During my academic career, I also volunteered as an accreditor for ABET, which, like IBM and FMC, IBM International Business Machines, FMC Food Machinery Corporation, shed its old name of the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology because we also included computing and applied science, and so now it's ABET, Inc. But as a consequence, I got to visit a lot of universities, the bulk of which were in the United States, but they also included Mexico, Canada, Japan, China, South Africa, and not without some interest, Ireland and the UK. In fact, I was chatting with the Vice Chancellor for Warwick, which was one of the universities I had the opportunity to visit. So with that as a preface, while we were talking about how this conference should be organized, and there were some teleconference phone calls, I asked the simple Emperor's New Clothes question: how do we know when we have achieved a research university? And that led to this session on metrics and evaluation. So I've told you I'm an accreditor. To my right is Phil Beatty, the editor for the Times Higher Education Ranking Survey, and then Stephen Troop, now with, it's the Munk Institute? Munk School at the University of Toronto, and most recently before that as Vice Chancellor for the University of British Columbia. So I'm going to open the session, Phil's going to chat, and then Stephen will end it up, and we'll show you where we're going. So in your handout was my 3 or 4 page on metrics and evaluation. I felt that if we were to be of any value, you needed lots of takeaways. You didn't need a lot of talk to, but things that you could refer to, and that's in the handout. As I've put in the middle, the goal for today is how do we use institutional data to better ourselves? And so we'll talk about accreditation, we'll talk about ranking, and I hope very significantly, and this is will be Stephen's job, institutional research and planning, how a university's administration can integrate these data into its forward thinking, whether strategic planning for the longer term or year-to-year budgeting. Now, we've said in the handout that accreditation assesses institutions or programs within an institution against mutually agreed upon criteria. And at one point, we used to talk about minimum standards, thresholds for accreditation, and that's when we were talking about process measures. And let me divert for just a second to an anecdote. The ABET engineering criteria were resolving every poor issue we'd ever seen. We went to a university and the laboratories were unsafe. We thought the way to deal with that is to have a laboratory plan. You couldn't teach advanced chemical engineering if you hadn't required a chemistry class. Physics had to be based on calculus and so forth. And it got longer and longer and longer, the criteria, page after page, of what we thought was appropriate for minimum standards. Until the Dean of Engineering at MIT said, this is a showstopper. This is limiting what we can do. It's not enhancing quality, it's limiting it. And out of that, and numerous other complaints, we asked ourselves the question, what is it that we really want to measure? And the answer was the outcomes. What can a student do when they're finished? And so rather than process, we started talking about performance. And by doing that, we also allowed ourselves to internationalize or globalize or become world-looking, because it didn't matter in what language it was being taught. What mattered is whether or not the student, when finished, could design something, whether something on paper, a computer program, or something physical, a car, a bridge, a microchip. Now, having said all that about accreditation, one of the things that we do have to look out for is that, in my country at least, there are any number of organizations that will take your money and give you a diploma. And what's more, if you look at their website, they'll tell you that they're accredited by somebody, but if you look it up, you'll find that they created the accreditation organization as well. And so there has to be some kind of standard for accreditation systems. The Council on Higher Education, I had to remember what the C stood for. The Council on Higher Education Accreditation in the United States is the organization that recognizes accreditation institutions. If you go to their website, right on the main page, they talk about diploma mills and why we should be careful to check the accreditation. And I suspect that as we embark on accreditation in Africa and Asia, there would be the potential for this abuse. I went to the websites. I went to, in my case, Google, and I typed in Quality Assurance Africa, and bang, up came the Association of African Universities with its support for a continent-wide quality assurance program, and quality assurance is accreditation. Asia is a little bit more diverse. If you go to Istanbul and you look across the Bosphorus, they tell you Asia begins there. So Ankara is an Asian, or the national university in Turkey is Asian. And Harbin, which is the coal city in the northeast of Outer Mongolia, one of the far provinces of China, also has universities. And so these are very, very different. What I did find was that Southeast Asia has come together either through ASEAN or similar organizations to look at quality assurance. India, and I will ask our colleagues from India what they might be able to, during the breakout, what they might be able to say about the National Assessment and Accreditation Council. Is this a sufficient organization to assure quality? Quality assurance in China is done by the Ministry of Education, who have embarked on a major organization over the last decade to gather in the ministry universities. There was a University of Iron and Steel Technology. There was a University of Shaft Sinking and Mining, and these have been brought back into more global universities. So the Beijing University of Science and Technology is the old Iron and Steel. And so the question before us is whether, through Rhodes House, we should engage with any or all of these agencies. Ranking, and I don't want to take a lot of time from Phil, tends to compare institutions with data from a particular pool of institutions. Some of the data are quantitative, and some, I looked at your numbers, Phil, 33% of the survey is divided up in reputation for teaching, 15, reputation for research, 18. So there is a hail fellow well met element inherent in ranking. By the way, Phil, as a dean of engineering, I used to get daily glossy magazines from my colleagues because they all wanted me to know how good they were, because I was expected to contribute to the reputational survey, in engineering at least, and provosts and presidents did the same thing for institutions. So we will have questions on ranking, and I thought to myself, and shared it with the others, that it was critically important, out of all this, the metrics and evaluations, that institutions be able to know themselves. I looked that one up in Google too. It turns out it comes from a Greek phrase. It's been around for a long time. Know thyself. Well, institutions need to know themselves, and that's through institutional research and planning, and Stephen's going to be talking about that. Let me just hit the bottom line there. As an accreditor, team chair, I would visit with the university's administration. I'd ask, is there an institutional research office? If there was, and if there was a staff person there of some rank who showed that it was a well-organized program, I was not surprised when my individual program evaluators, whether the mechanical engineer or the civil engineer or electrical or whomever, came back and said, you know, it's a pretty good program. And I felt that the two went together. And so what is it that we're going to do in the breakouts? We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation, but I hope that somewhere along the line we help to define a research university, consider association with continent-wide accreditation, provide for recognition of accreditation systems so that they are of high quality, and develop institutional research assistance programs, and then also to help define the pool for university rankings. Any and all of that is fair game. And so let me hand this over to Phil, and Phil, if you'd like to start, I'll get your slides up and running.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm very honoured, so thank you to Raj and to Alistair for inviting me. I don't want to take too long because I think we really need to go into the breakouts and start really throwing these ideas around and having good debates. But I just thought, as a sort of provocation really to this session, I'd run through the THE rankings methodology really to sort of hold it up for scrutiny. We need to be accountable. But just a brief introduction to myself and the rankings. I get remorselessly abused by my colleagues for putting this slide up. And this is the Zhu Shanlu, who was the party chairman of Peking University, who described me as the education secretary for the world. It's ludicrously over the top. Of course, it's diplomacy. He was being very nice. He was flattering me. But I use the slide for a couple of reasons. One, I think if I repeat it enough times, people might start to believe it, and my bosses might believe it. But two, more importantly, I think it does speak to the power of rankings. You know, we have this situation now where global rankings have become this incredibly powerful force. You know, they are starting to set the criteria of what a world-class university looks like, what it is, what it should look like. And I think it has massive challenges and problems around the power it has, but I think it also has this very positive effect that it brings people together to share information, to share data. It creates global data standards, it creates common global data definitions. We can actually start doing things really well in terms of bringing people together, giving visibility to rising powers, particularly in Asia. We see in East Asia rising stars. So I think rankings do have a really positive role to play as long as the rankers are accountable, as long as we are transparent. And one of the reasons I'm here is to be accountable and to let you help shape the future of rankings and make us more accountable and more responsive to your needs. THE, we've been around for 40 years. The rankings have been around we're in our 12th annual edition, so they're an incredibly young part of this global sector, actually. But I think it shows that they've rapidly become important because A, they are driving students' behaviour. We've just been talking in the break about, I think we have about 170 million students in the world. Those numbers are due to increase dramatically as the growing powers, in particular in East Asia, rising middle classes, huge numbers, as I see from the post, a huge number of young people in India who demand higher education, who need higher education. And they're shaping student decision making. This was a survey that was carried out which said that the ranking of a university was the #1 priority for internationally mobile students. More than course content, more than fees, more than location. The name, the brand, the reassurance, the trust they need when they're making a massive investment, the biggest investment in their future, means that rankings play this hugely influential role in shaping student movement. But they're also becoming a geopolitical tool. We've seen them becoming a policy maker's tool. used at the government level in Russia. Vladimir Putin has put our rankings in his economic plans. In Japan, similar situation. So they're becoming a phenomenon in geopolitics as well, shaping national policies. But that gives us a huge responsibility. We are hugely influential, but we have to be responsible. We have around 60 million visits to the site, 10 million unique visitors. That's growing every year. That's quite modest. I think this year the numbers will be much, much bigger. So we have to do a very, very responsible job. There's a quote that I assumed would be attributed to some grand figure, some US president or something, that was about with great power comes great responsibility, but it turns out it's from Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, yeah.
So it's not quite as portentous as I thought it was. But that's why I'm here. We need to be accountable, and I think there's a really important element around understanding the metrics of rankings. No ranking is worth anything unless you can break down those metrics, you can pull the scores out, and you can use them to fit your own mission. We should not be dictating the mission of universities. We should be informing universities' journeys by sharing the data and giving the information to allow the universities to create their own mission. So I'm just very quickly going to run through, because I know you've all got it on your sheet, so I don't think I want to take too much time, but we have 13 separate indicators across teaching, research, knowledge transfer, international output. Every single indicator has its weaknesses, has its limitations, and I think that's part of the conversation. What other indicators should we use? What else can we do? How can we make them better? But as Lee said, we rely heavily on a reputation survey, an international survey of academics, 10,000 respondents a year, carefully selected based on publication records to be representative of discipline and geography. We take this Humboldtian ideal. I think actually I might point out you can blame Stephen a little bit for this model of what a world-class research university should look like, because he helped us in trying to devise the weights and metrics for this ranking back in 2010 when we created it. But a Humboldtian ideal, research-intensive universities, a research-rich environment, but of course simple proxies like faculty-student ratios, income per faculty. In a real world, $200,000 per student is going to be offering a different experience to $20,000 per student. It's just part of realpolitik. International mix, your ability to recruit international students, your international collaborative research partnerships. I think there's an inherent goodness about being global in your outlook when it comes to talent, absorbing in talent. It shows your position in the marketplace, but I think it's an inherently positive thing to recognise and reward in a world-class research university. We look at your knowledge transfer, very simplistic at this stage. We're developing this, but how much income you draw in from the private sector, how much they're willing to put their hands in their pocket and fund you. Again, look at research as the biggest picture here. So research reputation survey, research income, research productivity, how many papers you're getting into the world's top indexed journals, scale for the size of the institution. And the flagship citation impact, how much your research is being picked up and disseminated and shared, how much it's contributing to new knowledge, how much it's pushing the boundaries of new knowledge. So that's the formula. I think what I really want to try and get out of this session is that, you know, the rankings, the overall composite scores, they grab the attention, they grab the headlines, they give you a big picture, but we're really keen as an organisation to give you what you genuinely need to help you on a development journey, to help you understand your institution. And I think that's where the huge opportunity comes. We worked directly with, this year it was 1,200 universities, pre-selected based on reputation, based on research output. We have a pool of 1,200 universities. We collect a huge amount of data. I worked out we have about 500,000 data points in our database just based on the reputation survey, the institutional data. That's not including the millions and millions of citations that we also count in partnership with Elsevier using the Scopus database. But we want to go deeper. We can work with individual universities. We can recreate these metrics. You can re-weight them, rebalance them depending on your individual needs or national needs or continental needs. We have a conference in Africa at the end of July in Johannesburg. What would you do differently for Africa? Would you put less weight on citation impact in the English language journals indexed by these Western organisations? Would you put more emphasis on local economic impact? How can we work with you to reshape these things? I'll leave it there because I think these are the challenges, the questions I'd like to try and drill down into and come away with a sense of how you can A, use rankings more to your individual needs, but B, how rankings can adapt and respond to your demands. And thanks very much.
Phil, thank you. That was excellent. And now, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Two preliminary observations on my colleagues' presentations in the interest of intellectual diversity on risks of accreditation and risks of rankings. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but in relation to accreditation, I'm very strongly supportive of the notion of quality control and self-assessment. I think that's very important. However, I will say, and really Lee hinted at it, if not well done, accreditation can have some very negative implications. One, it ratchets up costs because you have to meet external indicators rather than indicators that are self-defined. And in my view, even more importantly, and this has been a very practical problem with engineering accreditation in Canada, you can create unbelievably inflexible and cumbersome requirements and curricular inflexibility that I think doesn't match with the aspirations of many of our students. Among the hardest programs to reform are engineering programs because of the external accreditation elements. Focus on outcomes measures, as Lee said, absolutely crucial, and trying to move away from detailed requirements of the precise inputs. I think that's just something that everyone should think about if you're moving towards accreditation. On the rankings, I should, full disclosure now I can make in front of Phil, I decided in 2010 that instead of just complaining about rankings, I should try to step up and see whether there was any way of making them a bit better. And I have to say that the THE has been great in actually listening and trying to, I think, constantly improve its ranking. So I give them credit there. But I will say I still am very concerned about the tendency of rankings, not intentional, to discourage what I might call place-based, culturally grounded specificity in higher education. We have such pressures, you're quite right, Phil, no desire to dictate mission, and yet that's exactly, I think, what happens very often if you're uncritical about simply chasing the rankings. And there are many examples all around the world which I won't give. But we all end up having to meet the same metrics. Historically, that's undervalued the educational mission. I know you're trying to address that now, and really focus only on a particular construct of the research mission. And so I think universities in Africa and Asia have to think really seriously, and I'm glad they're going to have an opportunity in Johannesburg, to contribute to rethinking of rankings so that we have more ability to think about the uniqueness of our institutions and not simply the comparability of our institutions. Importance of institutional research and planning, data collection. I just think this is absolutely fundamental, and I think it's particularly important for young institutions who are in a kind of startup phase. I completely agree with Lee's point that the best advice we can give to each other is that old advice, know thyself. Because if you don't know who you are, you can't plan. And you can't plan either strategically for the long term or even year to year for budgeting purposes. You need data first to establish a baseline. Where are you? And then the data that will tell you whether you're meeting your self-defined objectives. Second point about data is when you have an academic or strategic plan in place, institution-wide data allows continuing assessment. And therefore, improvements can be measured, and of course, falling back can also be identified. That's a really important discipline, it seems to me, for any institution. And I actually see data collection not as a fetish, but as a discipline that we impose upon ourselves. The third reason that I think it's so important is that the data allows us better to make the case for support. Public support, governmental, philanthropic support. If we can tell a story that's meaningful, authentic, and speaks to a reality, we're far more likely to be convincing. So how might that work structurally within a university? My own view on this is that this is so important that the institutional review data collection function should either report to the president, vice chancellor, or to the chief academic officer or provost. It has to connect at the highest levels of the university so that the people who are in leadership positions actually know what the heck is going on. Secondly, we need to be really clear internally on what is the data that we want to collect. And this speaks in part to my earlier comments about external rankings, etc. I think first and foremost, we should identify our own goals in planning and then decide the data that we need to meet those goals. That's the first category. The second category is all the external stuff that someone else is going to ask you. Both are important, but I wouldn't start with the external. I'd start with our own purposes. We have to be responsive to governments, to ranking agencies, etc., but they shouldn't dictate our purposes. A second point related, very closely related, is that data collection has to be responsive and connected to the objectives of the academic leadership of the university, which includes the deans. So deans have to be deeply implicated in determining what data they need to manage their faculties most effectively. And I think that's a conversation that senior leadership and the deans should have together. I will say that too often those connections are not strong enough, and we often see data collected which is either simply easy to collect or is intellectually interesting to the staff in institutional planning. We have to be careful about that. We need to get the data that the leadership wants to actually make strategic and budget decisions. I will say that for me, when you're hiring leadership in institutional planning, I think that those people should be among the smartest and most creative people on campus. Yet, they're not the decision makers. So you want them to be people who really can push, get access to data, ask challenging questions, and be a bit creative about it, but they're not the leadership. Finally, I think it would be absolutely marvelous if within our different regions and even within our own countries, it were possible to create some standard data sets that allowed for comparison amongst institutions. This proves to be extremely difficult. We've tried to do it in my own situation in Canada. It would require an imposition of self-discipline and a willingness to move beyond a competitive model. In the province where I used to be, British Columbia, we did have a common data set that extended across all of the post-secondary institutions, but it's the only province in Canada that's managed to do it. Everyone else was a bit too competitive. But I think it's very helpful, again, in imposing discipline, because then you can compare relatively like-to-like institutions, and that is quite helpful. I think it's worth trying to move in that direction, acknowledging how difficult it is. End of the story is know thyself and decide yourself what it is you want to know. Thank you.
We're going to have a quick summary of the breakout sessions, and we're hopeful that they will give Chris a lot of material to put onto the board. And so we'll begin with Stephen's session, and Stephen tells me that Marvin Krisloff will be the rapporteur. Help us out.
We're not giving any time to get over.
Session. Stephen did a great job leading us. I think the overriding theme was that rankings are a mixed bag, that they may be a good tool for certain types of institutions that are similar, but they may skew priorities for others. Alex said that. And I think we talked a lot about mission and whether or not rankings distort mission or fail to recognize the diversity of institutional missions. And we talked about that both in terms of the US and the UK, but also in terms of Africa and Asia. We spend a fair amount of time talking about undergraduate choice, and Phil, what you said that these were being used as the number one factor, I take it, for international undergraduates. This concerned us greatly. We thought your rankings did not speak to the undergraduate experience and the teaching and learning that might take place. We noted that it excludes at least an American category of liberal arts colleges, but we also thought it didn't really talk about some of the key elements of what an undergraduate should be thinking about. And Stephen gave the example that the undergraduate experience or investment in an undergraduate experience, such as a first-year seminar program, was not rewarded. Many places worry about ratings influence strategies. I noted that the U.S. News has developed these ancillary categories that do attempt to talk about things like writing or experiential education that might be helpful. It's anecdotal and it's reputational. One question that Phil, I think, asked is, would drop-in ratings, do institutions try to maintain their position in ratings as opposed to moving up the ladder? And we talked about that. Stephen remarked that some of the shifts, particularly in the middle and lower tier of the ratings, from year to year seem to not reflect the reality of academic life, which is very slow to change. We talked a bit about accreditation and whether accreditation was perhaps a better tool for evaluating institutions, particularly in Africa and Asia, but we actually talked about it a lot outside. There was a comment by a woman whose name I don't know that it does not necessarily, the rankings don't necessarily reflect the importance of mentoring and so forth. But in terms of accreditation, we did think about, is that a model for Africa and Asia, where I gather professional organizations do most of the work, and our friend from Ghana mentioned that it would be valuable to have an accreditation tool that would allow doctors and other professionals to move across borders and not have to retake, let's say, a Canadian medical exam, so that there are some positive benefits. Phil talked about the engineering experience and that he thought that there would be some value in that. We talked about the difference between technical fields and accreditation and perhaps other fields as well. We heard that although there is some evaluation in taking place in China and India, not fully the accreditation tool that is seen certainly in the United States. Then sort of in the wrap-up, we just talked a lot about how in many countries, rankings help drive a trend already, which is to compete to be comprehensive universities, research universities, and in fact that may not be in the best interests of the country or educational institutions, which may have different missions. So that's sort of where we ended.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, no one from Library volunteered to report back.
Well, but they knew you were the man with the pen and the pad.
So I may have, and I wasn't taking notes, but I mean, following on very much from that, actually, we talked a little bit about, well, actually, Rick talked about the idea of much greater classification of universities to compare like with like, and I think as the rankings began, it was a very small top tier of research elite that perhaps are apples and apples in that sense, but as we go deeper, as more people get engaged, more institutions come on board, and you go deeper into regions, more aspire to those sorts of global benchmarks, the idea of being much clearer about classifying institutions, you know, in terms of size, shape, and particularly mission. You know, the clear issue is, you know, not everyone's mission will be to be world-class research-led. They may be very specifically focused on an individual subject area, for example. I think it's William from Chicago, I think, made a very good point about risk-taking, that, you know, rankings tend to mitigate against people taking risks and pushing themselves and challenging themselves, because you have half an eye on whether it will have a negative effect on the ranking position. I do think that's a real problem. We need to work out a way of celebrating and rewarding innovation. You know, if rankings just promote conservatism and uniformity, that is a challenge. So whether it's just about trying to surface more, one of the things we're really interested in doing at Times Higher Education is, yes, ranking, but then profiling much more. So you might have a university that's, you know, mired in the sort of late hundreds, or, you know, 700, 800 or whatever, but we can actually highlight individual aspects that it's particularly good at, proud of, it does well through partnership with the university. And I think it was Leonard was talking about, sorry, there you are, was talking about the importance of using rankings as a development tool. Actually, it's much more important to forget about the composite score, to forget about the actual rank, and just use the data in a way that you want to use it. What do you care about as an institution? And I just made the point that actually I did, and it really enhances what's been said a lot already, that I always find actually the universities that tend to be doing very well in rankings are the ones that perhaps care least about the actual ranking itself. They're not as worried or as driven by the metrics. They just do their thing, they do it well. And hopefully the rankings follow, the achievement rankings follow their own sense of doing things well, and the impact they have, and the impact and the reputational elements there. But as we're running out of time, I'll hand over straight away to...
I just want to add one thing. One of the things that we also discussed is the notion of institutional agency.
Can you hear Raj, or should we get a microphone for him? The microphone coming to you behind. Thank you.
I said one of the things that we also wanted to be discussed was the whole notion of institutional agency, in which ranking agencies are potentially, they could be more inclusive in their approach to involving different institutional imaginations into the rankings. So Times Higher Education's effort has been to, besides the big rankings of all the universities, there is also another ranking of the university years old, which essentially allows the possibility of little younger universities compared to the 800-year-old universities to be able to compete within that framework. There is also an effort to rank on disciplines. So in some ways, people are, in a way, why all of this is important is that even if institutions are doing well, the process of rankings can provide validation and a sense of appreciation for what they are doing, and that's why a broader framework of involving more institutions into the ranking process actually helps. So that's something which I know you're modest about not saying it, but I just wanted to mention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Our group was small, and I was negligent. I didn't appoint a note taker, so I'm it. We talked about a lot of things, many of which were similar to the other two groups. We asked ourselves, what is a research university, and ended up saying, why are we excluding other forms of very fine institutions of higher education, such as Marvin's allusion to the liberal arts colleges in the United States, Amherst, Williams, and you can go down a list of 100 or so that are really very good, not to exclude Oberlin, for example. So we also came up repeating Max Price's point about how many research universities are needed in a particular region. There are a substantial number of countries in Africa. If everyone was going to try and create a world-class research university, there wouldn't be enough public money to go around, and that was mentioned. And then all of a sudden we turned to the case for China, which, because they are, as one person says, obsessed with ranking, that there might be a case for countrywide rankings as opposed to even continent or global. And yet there's an awareness that the institutions that came to the top of a countrywide system might well also want to be judged in a global, and so perhaps there's a case for nesting country, region, global. We talked a little bit about how information might be fed into the ranking systems. Is the data feed consistent from university to university? Andrew talked about the qualifications framework in Singapore, which is different from ranking. It is an exercise from the government to determine whether or not funding should be returned at the same level or higher level or as appropriate. In the United Kingdom, we're aware that the research effectiveness framework actually has some real impact in terms of funding for research at a particular university, and it behooves any institution that wants to be known as research intensive to do well in that framework. Several people mentioned that research outputs as measured publications, citations, research funds, I would nearly said from my own background, research dollars per faculty member, which is one way to judge their ability to attract external funding, may not be as important to some countries as the development of social, cultural, and economic impacts where graduates may go forth and create and spread wealth, which is different from acquiring a research project. The interest on economic impact can skew systems where universities are created that will direct students into higher income, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, and several others, computing and so forth, at the expense of other more liberal subjects. We asked ourselves, is there scope for private universities in Africa? And we didn't answer the question, but we didn't know enough about it. We're aware that some nations wish to ensure that their universities were appropriately accessible to native populations, and that this would cause a skew in admissions policies. And based on the English system, there are countries that still ask a young person of 16 or 17 to pick her discipline rather than to pick her institution, and that this may cause, as the person develops and matures and discovers that he didn't really want to be a mining engineer, he would much prefer to be a business major, and that there's not a lot of scope for transfer. And that opened up the notion that maybe freshman year or even 2 year of general studies for all students, and then pick a discipline once they've become a little more mature. So we ended on a note of discussing some of the partnerships that had developed around the world. Andrew again talked about working with Yale and Duke in developing certain specialized programs that they might not have been able to develop on their own. That came to an end, but Marvin, as you were speaking about homogenization of universities, I suddenly remembered we haven't discussed at all the Bologna process for homogenization in the European Union. And this is a significant factor here that might well provide a model for other regions and other continents. And so next time around, perhaps we can have somebody who's knowledgeable on Bologna to talk about that. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues, and Alistair's going to tell us where lunch is, but if I could give them a hand.